A starving mountain girl with nothing but her dignity is forced to choose between watching her family freeze to death in poverty or marrying a mysterious stranger who rides out of blizzard with an offer that sounds too good to be true. Against the snow-heavy peaks and frost-crusted pines of the Colorado Rockies, we meet Grace Morrison. She is 24 years old, with copper-red hair pulled back in practical braid, wearing a patchwork dress that's been mended so many times the original fabric barely shows. Her hazel eyes burn with a fierce determination, even as hunger has hollowed her cheeks and exhaustion has carved shadows beneath her eyes. The introduction establishes life or death stakes. Her father, Thomas Morrison, is dying slowly from lung fever contracted during brutal winters working failed mining claims. Her 3 siblings, 15-year-old Sarah, 11-year-old Benjamin, and 8-year-old Lucy, are growing thinner each day as their food stores dwindle, and the Denver Banking Consortium has sent collectors who will seize their land, cabin, and livestock within the week if the $300 debt isn't paid. The only path forward is a marriage built on desperation rather than love, to a man whose eyes hold secrets as deep as the mountains themselves. Welcome to Brian's Tales, where every story takes you on an unforgettable journey. Whether it's thrilling adventures, heartwarming moments, or tales that'll keep you on the edge of your seat, this is your destination for captivating storytelling. If you love getting lost in exciting narratives and discovering new worlds with every video, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out on the next amazing tale. Trust me, you won't miss what's coming next. Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow loft bed she shared with her sisters, listening to Sarah's soft breathing beside her and Lucy's small whimpers as she dreamed. Below, her father's cough tore through the silence, wet rattling, the sound of a man drowning from the inside. Each cough was a countdown. Each day brought them closer to the edge of an abyss they couldn't climb out of. Eli's offer circled her mind like a hawk. Marriage in exchange for survival. $300 to settle the debt. Food and supplies to last the winter. Her family's homestead saved. All she had to do was marry a stranger and leave everything she'd ever known. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes until colors burst behind her eyelids. She thought of her mother's last words 2 years ago, her voice thin as paper. Take care of them, Grace. You're strong enough. But she didn't feel strong. She felt like livestock being bartered at market, her worth measured in dollars in desperation. At dawn, she descended the ladder to find Eli already awake, feeding split logs into the dying embers with the efficiency of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. In daylight, she studied him properly, probably 32 or 33, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and storm-gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything without judgment. His clothes were simple but well-made, his hands calloused but his posture straight. There was something in the way he moved that suggested capability, like a man who'd never questioned whether he could handle what life threw at him. You don't have to decide today, Eli said without looking at her. But your creditors arrive in 6 days. I know exactly when they arrive, Grace replied, sharper than intended. I've been counting down to our destruction for months. They talked while her father slept fitfully in his chair, and her siblings huddled near the meager fire. Eli explained in that careful, measured way he had. He lived alone in the high country, on his land outright, made a living as a wilderness guide and trapper. He needed a wife because isolation becomes unbearable after enough winters alone. He'd heard she was capable, intelligent, unafraid of hard work. Why us? Grace asked, suspicion edging her voice. Why not find a wife in town like a normal man? Eli's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Town women want things I can't provide. Society, gatherings, neighbors. I need someone who understands that mountains demand everything and give back only what you earn. Before Grace could respond, her brother Benjamin coughed, that same wet, horrible sound that echoed their father's illness. Lucy's stomach growled audibly in the silence that followed. Sarah watched Grace with desperate, pleading eyes that said what her voice couldn't. Please save us. By Sunday, Pine Ridge buzzed like a disturbed hive. At church service, women whispered behind gloved hands while their eyes tracked Grace's movements. Mrs. Abernathy cornered her after service, concern dripping like honey from a poisoned spoon. Dear child, you know nothing about this man. He could be dangerous. He could be hiding terrible things in those mountains. But Mr. Jennings in the general store pulled Grace aside with genuine kindness in his weathered face. I've seen him trade furs in town a few times over the years. Keeps to himself, but he's always been honest, always paid fair. Some men are solitary by nature, not by malice. Eli returned 3 days later with a wagon loaded with supplies that made Grace's throat tight. Flour, sugar, salt pork, beans, dried apples, and firewood already split. He didn't ask for gratitude or press for a decision. He simply unloaded everything with quiet efficiency and said, "These are yours regardless of your choice. Your family needs to eat." That gesture, that simple act of giving without demanding, cracked something in Grace's chest. She watched him work, noting how he moved with purpose, how he handed the supplies to her father with respect rather than pity, how he ruffled Benjamin's hair and made Lucy smile by producing a peppermint stick from his pocket like a conjurer. That night, her father called Grace to his bedside. His face had gone the color of old ash. His breathing labored even at rest. Grace. His hand trembled as it found hers. I'm dying. We both know it. I need to know you'll all be safe before I go. His eyes, once sharp and bright, had dimmed to something fragile. This man, there's something decent in his eyes. Something steady. Take the offer. Save yourself in them. Grace pressed her forehead against her father's weathered hand and let herself cry for the first time in months. Not the silent tears she shed in the dark, but real sobs that shook her shoulders. She thought of all the dreams she'd harbored in secret. Teaching school someday, choosing her own husband for love rather than necessity, having time to read books and think about something other than survival. Those dreams felt like childhood fantasies now, as distant and impossible as the stars wheeling overhead. At dawn on the fourth day, Grace stepped onto the porch where Eli waited beside his wagon. Her siblings crowded the doorway behind their father's chair, small faces tight with hope and fear. The mountain air bit her lungs with cold sharp enough to make her gasp. She looked at Eli, really looked, searching for cruelty or deception hidden behind that steady gaze. She found only patience in something that might have been loneliness worn smooth by time. I accept your offer, Grace said, forcing her voice steady despite her trembling hands. But I want your word on 3 things. My family keeps this homestead. You settle the debt completely, and you treat me with respect, not like property you purchased. Eli met her eyes without flinching. You have my word on all 3. I'm not looking for a servant, Grace. I'm looking for a partner. The word hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Partner, as if she could be his equal rather than his obligation. 3 days later, Reverend Thomas married them in the small pine church with only Grace's family and a handful of curious townspeople watching. Grace wore her mother's dress, simple gray wool with a cream lace collar, and her mother's silk veil, yellow with age but still beautiful. Eli wore a clean shirt and black vest, his hair combed back, looking more refined than she expected. When he took her hand to speak his vows, his touch was warm and steady, callous but gentle. When she spoke hers, her voice didn't shake even though everything inside her was trembling. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes to change her entire life. As they left Pine Ridge in Eli's wagon, Grace watched her childhood home disappear behind the trees. Her father stood on the porch despite his weakness, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face, but relief softening the lines of pain. Her siblings waved until they vanished around the bend. Sarah solemn and brave, Benjamin trying not to cry, Lucy calling, "Come back soon," as if Grace was just going to market. Grace gripped the edge of the wagon seat and didn't look back again. She just traded her future to a stranger who promised partnership, but might deliver only more hardship in a different form. She didn't know if she'd been saved or she'd made the worst mistake of her life. All she knew with certainty was that there was no going back now. The die was cast. Her fate was sealed. And somewhere ahead in those towering mountains that scraped the sky like God's own cathedral, a life she couldn't yet imagine was waiting to swallow her whole. The journey into the high country began on roads Grace recognized, packed dirt trails connecting Pine Ridge to neighboring settlements. But within hours, those familiar paths narrowed into routes that seemed barely traveled. Eli drove the wagon with quiet confidence, his eyes constantly scanning terrain ahead, reading the landscape like other men read newspapers. Grace sat beside him wrapped in a wool shawl, watching familiar low-altitude forests give way to denser stand of pine that grew taller and closer together, their branches interlocking overhead until sky became fragments of blue between dark green. The air changed too, sharper, thinner, carrying scent of resin and stone and something wild that had no name. They barely spoke that first day. Grace was exhausted from sleepless nights and emotional weight of leaving her family. Eli seemed content with silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks in that careful, measured way he had. That peak to the north is Mount Wilson. We'll pass east of it tomorrow. His voice was educated, the diction precise, not the rough speech of most mountain men she'd known. That first night, Eli made camp with practiced efficiency that bordered on artistry. He built a fire that produced minimal smoke but maximum heat, positioned rocks to reflect warmth toward their shelter, and set up a canvas lean-to that blocked wind with perfect geometry. The gear he used caught Grace's attention. The canvas was new and waterproof, not patched and threadbare like she'd expected. His cooking implements were well-made iron rather than battered tin. His knife had a bone handle worn smooth by use, but clearly expensive in its making. "You said you're a guide and trapper," Grace ventured as they ate beans and salt pork that somehow tasted better than it should. "How long have you been in these mountains?" "All my life," Eli answered. "Born here. My father taught me everything. How to read weather patterns, track game, survive storms that would kill a careless man in hours." "Were you close? You and your father?" Something shadowed Eli's face. "We were. He died 3 years ago. Winter fever took him in less than a week." Grace nodded, understanding settling between them like a familiar weight. "My mother died 2 years past. Also fever. These mountains take as much as they give." For the first time, Eli looked at her across the fire with something other than careful politeness, a recognition of shared grief, of understanding what it meant to lose someone to the indifferent cruelty of wilderness and winter. "You've been carrying your family alone since then." "Someone had to," Grace said simply. The second day brought steeper climbs and air, so thin Grace's lungs burned with every breath. She refused to complain, but she noticed more inconsistencies in Eli's story. When she mentioned reading about the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad expansion in an old newspaper, he spoke knowledgeably about infrastructure development and capital investment, terms she'd read but never heard spoken by wilderness guides. When they passed a grove of aspens shimmering gold in afternoon light, he commented on sustainable harvesting practices and regeneration cycles, like someone who'd studied forestry formally, not just observed it. "You're well-read for a mountain man," Grace observed carefully, watching his reaction. Eli's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "Winter months are long. A man needs something to occupy his mind besides survival." It was a reasonable answer, But Grace heard the evasion beneath it. She'd spent her life reading people, learning to assess whether creditors were bluffing, whether traveling merchants could be trusted, whether her father's optimism about a new mining claim was genuine or desperate self-deception. Eli was hiding something. The way he spoke, the quality of his gear, the confidence in his movements. None of it quite matched the story he'd told. The third night, they camped beside a stream so clear Grace could count individual stones on the bottom. Stars overhead blazed with impossible brightness, undimmed by any distant town lights. Eli caught 2 trout with his bare hands, a skill that took years to master, and cooked them over the fire with wild herbs he identified without hesitation. Sage for flavor, juniper for digestion, a touch of wild thyme for balance. After they ate, Grace asked, "Where exactly is your cabin? How much farther?" "One more day," Eli said. "We'll reach it tomorrow evening." "And it's livable?" Grace tried to keep judgment from her voice. "I don't mean luxury. I just mean it has a solid roof, a good stove, and enough room for both of us," Eli answered. His gray eyes caught firelight, turning them almost silver. "I know you're expecting hardship, Grace. I know you think you've traded one difficult life for another. But I promise you'll be safe. You'll have enough to eat. And you'll have space to be more than just someone's burden." The word surprised her. Most men wouldn't acknowledge her fear, wouldn't recognize her need for autonomy. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it. That night, lying under the canvas shelter with Eli a respectful distance away, Grace stared at stars and tried to imagine what awaited her. She touched the gold ring on her finger, heavier than she'd expected, with tiny engraved patterns she could barely trace in darkness. Not the ring of a poor man. The 4th day climbed higher than Grace had ever been, above the timberline where only twisted pines survived and wind howled constantly. The air was so thin each breath felt like work, but the view stole what little breath she had. Mountain ranges stretching the horizon like frozen waves, valleys filled with shadow and mist, the world vast and indifferent to human concerns. Eli drove with focused intensity now, his jaw set, hands tight on the reins. Grace sensed tension, anticipation mixed with apprehension. They were close to something important, something that mattered deeply to him in ways he hadn't explained. As the sun began its descent, painting everything gold and crimson, Eli guided the wagon onto a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into impossibly dense forest. They climbed through pines so ancient and massive they blocked out dying light. The wagon wheels creaked. Eli's breathing changed, shallow, controlled, like a man bracing for impact. Then they broke through onto a ridge, and Eli pulled the horses to a stop. Grace looked ahead, and her breath caught. Below them spread a hidden valley that seemed impossible, a secret carved into the mountains themselves. A meadow still green despite the season, a stream winding through it like molten silver, groves of aspens and pines arranged with almost deliberate beauty. And at the center, rising like something from a fever dream, not a rough cabin, but a mansion, a 3-story timber palace with stone foundations, wraparound verandas, windows that caught sunset like mirrors, formal gardens, outbuildings, stone paths, painted fences, and smoke rising from multiple chimneys. Grace gripped the wagon seat until her knuckles went white. Her mind couldn't reconcile what her eyes showed her. Eli's voice came low and tight beside her. "Welcome home, Grace. Welcome to Thornhill Manor." And Grace realized with shock that pierced her like mountain cold. She knew absolutely nothing about the man she'd just married. As the wagon descended into the valley, Grace's shock crystallized into something colder and harder, anger that built with each turn of the wheels like pressure behind a dam. Eli had lied. Not a small lie, not an omission, but deliberate, calculated deception that had shaped every moment of their courtship, every word of their marriage vows, every assumption she'd made about the life she was choosing. She'd married poverty to escape poverty, Except she hadn't. She'd married wealth while believing she was sacrificing everything, and somehow that made a betrayal cut deeper than any honest hardship could have. They approached the mansion along a maintained road lined with young trees, planted at precise intervals. Grace saw workers in the distance, men in sturdy clothes tending livestock, repairing fences, managing what was clearly a working estate of considerable size. A man in his 50s emerged from a main entrance, formally dressed in a dark suit with a pressed collar, walking toward it with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what was expected of him. Mr. Thornhill, the man called, relief evident in his refined voice. "Welcome home, sir. We prepared everything precisely as you requested. The east wing has been opened and aired, fresh linens on the bed, and cook has dinner ready whenever you're prepared." Mr. Thornhill, not Eli the guide, not Eli the humble trapper. Mr. Thornhill of Thornhill Manor. Grace turned slowly to look at her husband. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted slightly, and the weathered mountain man persona fell away like a coat he was shrugging off after a long journey. He looked like someone who had always been in charge, someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. "Thank you, Harrison," Eli said. "Please have a horses seen to. My wife and I have much to discuss privately." "Of course, sir." Harrison's eyes flicked to Grace with barely concealed curiosity before he turned away with professional discretion. Eli offered his hand to help Grace down from the wagon. She ignored it, climbing down herself with stiff, deliberate movements, her mind racing too fast for words. He led her up stone steps worn smooth by use, across a wide veranda with intricately carved railings, and through massive double doors made of polished oak with brass fixtures that gleamed in the fading light. The interior stole Grace's breath despite her fury. The entry hall rose 2 stories high, dominated by a grand staircase that curved upward like something from a storybook. Gleaming hardwood floors reflected light from a massive iron chandelier that must have held 50 candles. Through open doorways she glimpsed a formal parlor with furniture that looked imported from the East, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a dining room with a table long enough to seat 20. Everything was immaculate, maintained, expensive beyond any scale Grace had ever imagined. The air smelled of beeswax polish and cedar and money. Eli guided her into a sitting room where fire already crackled in a stone fireplace large enough to stand inside. The walls were paneled in rich wood and hung with oil paintings, landscapes of mountains she recognized, portraits of stern-faced people who must be ancestors. He closed the doors behind them, giving them privacy, then turned to face her with an expression that mixed guilt, apprehension, and something that looked almost like defiance. Grace stood rigid in the center of the room, still wearing her simple travel clothes, her copper braid dusty from 4 days on the road, feeling utterly alien in this opulent space. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaking, not with fear, but with barely controlled rage. "Who are you?" The question came out sharp as broken glass. "And don't you dare say Eli the mountain guide, because we both know that's a lie." Eli removed his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair, and met her eyes directly. "My name is Elijah Thornhill. I am the sole heir to the Thornhill timber and railroad empire. My father, Jonathan Thornhill, built this estate and the business over 40 years. When he died 3 years ago, everything passed me." The words hit Grace like physical blows. Timber empire, railroad, heir. Every assumption she'd made, every moment of agonizing over her sacrifice, every night she mourned giving up her dreams to marry into hardship, all of it built on a foundation of lies. "You lied to me," Grace said, her voice rising despite her attempts to control it. "You stood in my father's cabin while he was dying, while my siblings were starving, and you pretended to be a simple man offering a simple life. You watched me agonize over giving up everything I wanted, watched me cry over trading my future for survival, and you said nothing. I needed to know, Eli began, but Grace cut him off with a sharp gesture. Know what? Whether I was worthy of you, whether I'd love you for your precious, lonely self instead of your money. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You talk about needing authenticity, but you're the one who built our entire relationship on deception. I made that choice believing I was choosing hardship to save my family. I mourned my lost dreams thinking I was trading them for a bare survival. And all along, you had the power to give me everything, but you hid it to test my character like I was some kind of experiment. Eli's face flushed. Every woman I've met in Denver wanted only the fortune. Every conversation was calculated, women and their families positioning themselves, weighing my worth like I was a prize horse at auction. My own father died paranoid and isolated because he couldn't trust anyone's motives. I watched what wealth did to him, how it poisoned every relationship until he had nothing real left. His voice rose to match hers. Yes, I tested you. Yes, I want to know if someone could see me, the actual man, instead of the money. Is that so terrible? Yes, Grace nearly shouted. Because you didn't trust me enough to make an informed choice. You manipulated the situation to get what you wanted while taking away my agency completely. You put on a costume and played a role, and I fell for it because I was desperate and you were offering salvation. But it wasn't real salvation. It was a trap disguised as mercy. She took a step toward him, her whole body trembling with fury. You tested whether I could love a poor man, but you never gave me the chance to prove I could see past wealth to the real person. You assumed I'd be just like those Denver women, without ever giving me the opportunity to show you otherwise. You took away my power to choose while pretending to give me a choice. The accusation landed hard. Eli's expression shifted from defensive to genuinely stricken, as if he was seeing for the first time how his elaborate deception had stolen Grace's agency just as thoroughly as her poverty had. Before either could speak again, they heard the distant sound of multiple carriages arriving, horses moving fast, wheels crunching on gravel. Eli's face went pale. No, not yet. I told them we'd return next week. He strode to the window and pulled back the heavy curtain. Grace followed and looked out to see 3 carriages pulling up to the entrance, expensive vehicles with matched horses and brass fittings that gleamed even in the dying light. Who is that? Grace asked, her anger temporarily suspended by confusion and growing dread. Eli's jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jump. My aunt, Constance Thornhill. She's been managing the estate's business affairs since my father died. He turned to Grace with sudden urgency. Listen carefully. Constance did not want me to marry. She's been pushing me towards socially advantageous matches with daughters of railroad magnates and mining barons. When I disappeared 3 weeks ago without explanation, she would have been furious. And now I've returned with a wife she knows nothing about. A wife from a dirt-poor mountain family with no connections, no social standing, and no training in how to navigate your world. Grace said bitterly, I'm going to be exactly what she fears, aren't I? The unsuitable wife who damages the precious family reputation. You're my choice, Eli said fiercely. And that's what matters. Does it? Grace asked quietly, all her anger draining into something colder and more frightening. Doubt that settled in her chest like ice. Or am I just the latest move in whatever game you're playing with your aunt and Denver society? The front doors opened downstairs. They heard a woman's commanding voice giving sharp instructions. Footsteps clicking on hardwood with military precision. The rustle of expensive skirts. Then the sitting room doors opened without a knock, without permission, with the presumption of someone who believed she had more right to this house than anyone else. Constance Thornhill swept into the room like winter frost made flesh. Grace woke to unfamiliar softness and disorientation before memory crashed back. The mansion, the lies, Constance's cold assessment. She rose despite exhaustion, dressed in a simple day dress, and ventured downstairs while the house still held morning quiet. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. O'Brien already working, flour dusting her hands as she kneaded bread with practiced rhythm. The woman looked up with warm brown eyes and a slight Irish lilt. "Well now, you're an early riser, Mrs. Thornhill. Couldn't sleep in that fancy bed." "I've never been able to sleep past dawn," Grace admitted. Mrs. O'Brien gestured a stool and poured strong black tea without asking. As Grace sipped, the cook worked and talked, her chatter revealing more than intended. The staff had adored Eli's mother. Constance was respected but not loved. Eli himself was considered fair, but increasingly isolated. "The lad needs someone real," Mrs. O'Brien said firmly. "Not one of those painted society dolls." His mum knew what mattered. She'd roll up her sleeves and help with harvest preserving. She gave Grace a meaningful look. "I'm thinking you might be cut from similar cloth." It was an offering of alliance. Grace accepted gratefully. That afternoon, Grace wandered the halls with deliberate aimlessness, paying attention to which rooms held conversations, where Constance spent her time. She passed near Eli's study, doors left slightly ajar, when Constance's voice stopped her cold. "She's completely unsuitable for what we've built. No connections, no training, no family worth cultivating. The Denver Society wives will tear her apart." "A man's voice," the lawyer Pemberton. "The marriage is legal, Constance, unless you can prove fraud." "I don't need to prove incompetence," Constance interrupted coldly. "I just need to demonstrate it publicly. One disastrous social event, and the board will question Eli's judgment. They're already concerned about his rustic phase. Add an unsuitable wife causing scandal, and we can argue he needs oversight, perhaps temporary transfer of authority, while he sorts out his personal affairs." Grace pressed against the wall, barely breathing. Pemberton sounded uncertain. "That's dangerous. Eli has majority voting shares, which require board approval for major decisions per the trust provisions his father established." Constance said triumphantly, "Jonathan built in safeguards against single-person control. If I convince the board that Eli is making emotionally driven decisions that threaten the company, and a scandalous marriage to a penniless nobody certainly qualifies, they can impose restrictions. And the girl will realize she's entered a world that doesn't want her. I'll provide just enough help to ensure she fails spectacularly. Then she'll either leave voluntarily, or we'll have grounds to suggest the marriage was a mistake made during temporary instability." Constance's voice turned even colder. "Sentiment has no place in business. He should have married Victoria as planned." Grace moved away silently, her mind racing. Constance wasn't just disapproving. She was actively plotting to destroy Grace's marriage and seize control of the company. The offered help with etiquette, the society events, all traps. She returned to the library and did what she always did when facing impossible situations. She armed herself with knowledge. She pulled down books on Colorado territorial law, corporate governance, property rights. If she was going to fight, she needed to understand the battlefield. That evening at dinner, just Grace and Eli in a room that could seat 30, Eli looked exhausted, still wearing business clothes. "I'm sorry for today. Meetings ran long. Constance is pushing for railroad expansion that would require massive clear-cutting. Your aunt thinks I'm going to ruin you," Grace said bluntly. "She told me so this afternoon." Eli's jaw tightened. Constance has fixed ideas about what's appropriate. "I heard her talking to Pemberton," Grace interrupted. "She's planning to use me to demonstrate you're unfit to run the company. She's going to set me up to fail publicly, so it looks like incompetence rather than sabotage." Eli's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "She wouldn't." "She would, and she is." Grace cut him off. "So I need to know, do you actually want me here, Or did you marry me to prove a point about not being controlled? The question hung sharp between them. Eli looked at Grace across the expensive china, really looked at the intelligence in her hazel eyes, the determination in her jaw, the strength forged by survival. I want you here, he said finally. I married you because in 3 conversations, you showed me more genuine humanity than years of Denver society. You didn't perform or calculate. You existed honestly. That's what I wanted. Then help me fight for it, Grace said, because your Anne is coming for both of us, and I refuse to lose. For the first time since arriving, Grace saw Eli smile genuinely. Then we fight together. When you're facing Constance Thornhill, you need weapons. Let me teach you everything she doesn't want you to know. They spent the evening in the library while Eli explained the intricate web of business relationships, key Denver society players, their vulnerabilities. Grace absorbed it all like drought-dry soil drinks water. Around midnight, Eli walked Grace to her bedroom door, pausing uncertainly. I know I handled everything wrong. The deception, the test. I was so focused on finding authenticity that I didn't consider how my methods stripped away your agency. I'm sorry. Grace studied his face, genuine remorse mixed with lingering fear. I'm still angry, but right now we have a common enemy. So let's focus on that and work on trust later. Not forgiveness, not rejection. The beginning of something more equal. As Grace prepared for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror. Same copper hair, same hazel eyes, but dressed in fine clothes, standing in a mansion, married to a man she was only beginning to understand. Constance thought she was easy prey. Victoria thought her unsophisticated. Denver society waited to watch her fail. Grace smiled at her reflection, not gently, but with a hardness of someone who'd survived winters that killed weaker people. Let them try, she whispered. I've beaten worse odds. Tomorrow, the real battle began. 2 days later, Grace sat in a carriage heading into Denver. Her first time leaving the valley since her arrival. The city sprawled larger than she remembered from childhood glimpses. Buildings rising 3 and 4 stories. Streets packed with wagons and riders. Telegraph wires strung overhead like geometric spider webs. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, this hub of commerce and power, where her worth would be constantly measured. Governor Pierce's residence was elegant but not ostentatious. A brick townhouse in a respectable neighborhood that spoke of taste rather than showmanship. They were shown into a book-lined study where the governor waited. A man in his late 50s with silver hair, keen blue eyes, and the weathered face of someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors despite his political career. Eli. He greeted warmly, clasping hands with genuine pleasure. Then he turned to Grace with a respectful bow. Mrs. Thornhill, your husband speaks very highly of your intelligence and character. I'm delighted to finally meet you. There was no condescension in his tone, no assessment of her worth based on her clothes or background, just straightforward courtesy. Grace felt tension she hadn't known she was carrying begin to ease. They sat, and Eli explained with refreshing directness. Constance is maneuvering to undermine Grace's position and question my judgment. She's using your winter reception as a proving ground, planning to set Grace up to fail publicly. Pierce's expression darkened. That woman has been lobbying me for months to approve timber contracts that would devastate mountain communities. Clear-cutting proposals that prioritize short-term profit over sustainability. He turned to Grace. What do you know about the proposed railroad expansion to the Elk Creek watershed? Grace thought back to overheard conversations, newspapers she'd read. Elk Creek supplies water to 3 farming valleys and 2 mining camps. Clear-cutting the watershed would cause catastrophic erosion and contaminate the water supply within 2 years. Hundreds of families would be displaced. Pierce's eyebrows rose with genuine respect. Exactly right. Did Eli tell you that? No, sir. I grew up watching what happens when people don't respect mountain ecology. Water is life in the high country. Anyone who's lived there knows that. The governor exchanged a meaningful look with Eli. Mrs. Thornhill, I think we need to discuss something important. He leaned forward. Colorado is changing rapidly. We're on the cusp of statehood. The decisions we make now about resource management and sustainable development will define this territory for generations. We need voices who understand both business realities and human cost. Voices like yours. Grace blinked, uncertain. I'm not sure I understand, sir. I'm establishing an advisory council on mountain community development, Pierce explained. Representatives who can speak authentically about the needs facing our rural populations while interfacing with business and political leaders. It's newly created, but it carries official territorial authority. He paused. I'd like to offer you an appointment. The words landed like thunderbolts. Me? But I have no official experience. You have lived experience, Pierce interrupted gently. You've survived the very conditions we're trying to address. You understand what families need, what policies help versus harm. And from what Eli tells me, you're more than capable of learning the administrative skills required. He smiled slightly. Also, let's be honest, an official territorial appointment would rather complicate Constance's narrative that you're merely an unsuitable social climber, wouldn't it? Eli was grinning openly. It's brilliant. An appointed official with recognized standing? That changes everything. Grace's mind raced through implications. An official position would give her legitimacy, authority, and, most critically, legal standing that would make it harder for Constance to dismiss her as irrelevant. It would also give her real work, real purpose beyond surviving society parties. What would be required? Grace asked carefully. Pierce outlined the responsibilities. Quarterly council meetings, reviewing development proposals for community impact, liaison between rural populations and government officials, contributing to policy recommendations. Real work with real consequences. I would need to learn a great deal, Grace said honestly, about territorial law, bureaucratic procedures, policy development. I have staff who can provide training, Pierce assured her. But the core requirement is integrity and genuine concern for the communities you'd represent. Those can't be taught. You either have them or you don't. Based on this conversation and Eli's recommendations, I believe you have them. Grace looked at Eli, whose expression was encouraging but carefully neutral, leaving the choice entirely to her. She thought about Constance's sneering dismissal, Victoria's assumption she'd fail, Denver society waiting to watch her crumble. Then she thought about mountain families like her own, struggling to survive while distant businessmen made decisions affecting their lives without ever asking their input. I accept, Grace said firmly. When do I start? Pierce broke into a broad smile. Officially, immediately. I'll have paperwork drawn up today. Your first council meeting is in 3 weeks. Plenty of time to prepare. But, Grace, his expression turned serious. This will make you enemies. People who profit from exploiting mountain communities won't appreciate an authentic voice challenging their proposals. Constance in particular will see this as war. Good, Grace said quietly, because that's exactly what it is. They spent another hour discussing specifics. Pierce provided reading materials, reports, proposals, territorial statutes. He also gave candid advice about navigating social events. Information is currency in Denver. Listen more than you speak. Let others reveal positions before showing your hand. Never let them see uncertainty. As they prepared to leave, Pierce took Grace's hand warmly. Your husband found something rare in you, Mrs. Thornhill. Not just strength, but conviction. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The ride back was quiet, but charged with new energy. Eli finally broke the silence. You realize what you just agreed to? Constance is going to be furious. I'm counting on it, Grace replied, watching mountains rise ahead. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt solid ground beneath her feet. She wanted to control the narrative. Unsuitable mountain girl, overwhelmed by society. Now she'll contend with territorial advisor Grace Thornhill instead. That's much harder to spin. Eli reached over and took her hand, the first truly affectionate gesture since truth was revealed. I'm sorry I tested you. I should have trusted you from the beginning. Grace squeezed back. You're still earning that trust. But this, helping me find my own power instead of just protecting me, this is a good start. That evening, when Constance arrived for another lesson, Grace was ready. They gathered in the parlor, Constance preparing to continue her condescending tutorials, when Grace spoke first. Aunt Constance, I appreciate the time you've invested in my education. However, I've decided to pursue a different approach to preparing for society. Constance's expression sharpened like a blade being drawn. Oh, and what approach would that be? Governor Pierce has appointed me as territorial advisor for mountain community development. I'll be attending official meetings, reviewing policy proposals, representing rural populations in government discussions. I thought you should know, since it affects how the family is represented publicly. Color drained from Constance's face, then flooded back in angry crimson. You did what? Without consulting me? Without considering how this affects the Thornhill reputation. The governor believed my perspective would be valuable, Grace said calmly. And as you mentioned repeatedly, the Thornhill name carries community responsibilities. This seems an excellent way to fulfill them. Victoria looked genuinely shocked. Constance stood abruptly, composure cracking. This is completely inappropriate. You have no idea what you're doing. You'll embarrass yourself in this family. Actually, Eli's voice cut in from the doorway where he'd been listening. I think it's an excellent appointment. The company has needed better community relations. Having Grace in an official capacity creates valuable connections. Constance turned on her nephew with barely controlled fury. You arranged this. This is your way of undermining my authority. This is my way of supporting my wife. Eli said firmly, something you made very clear you have no intention of doing. The confrontation ended with Constance sweeping from the room in rage, Victoria trailing uncertainly behind. After they left, Eli turned to Grace with something like awe. You didn't tell me you were planning to announce it that way. I wasn't sure until the moment came, Grace admitted. But seeing her so certain of my failure, so convinced I'd just accept her control, I couldn't let that stand. She needed to know I'm not her puppet. That night, Grace lay awake not in anxiety but exhilaration. She'd claimed her own power in a world designed to keep her powerless. She had allies now. Pierce, Eli perhaps, and the quiet support of staff who'd watched Constance's machinations for years. Constance wanted battle? She'd get one. But not the battle she expected. The mountain girl had found her footing. Now came the real test. The road to Denver felt different this time. Grace sat in a fine carriage wearing a forest green gown that Mrs. Hartley had commissioned, well-made but not ostentatious, with clean lines that suggested both practicality and refinement. Her copper hair was arranged in an elegant, upswept style that had taken the maid an hour to perfect. She wore simple pearl earrings that had belonged to Eli's mother, a gesture he'd offered quietly the night before. You don't have to wear them if it feels like pressure, he'd said. Grace had taken them anyway, not as surrender, but as armor. If she was going to face Denver society, she'd do it looking like she belonged. As the city materialized around them, brick buildings rising like monuments to commerce, streets packed with carriages bearing families whose names appeared in newspapers, Grace felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't a private meeting with an ally. This was the battlefield Constance had chosen, and Grace was walking directly into it. The Brown Palace Hotel rose before them, 6 stories of red granite and sandstone with arched windows that gleamed in afternoon sunlight. Doormen in crisp uniforms opened the carriage door. Grace stepped onto pavement instead of dirt, her boots clicking with unfamiliar authority. Inside, the lobby buzzed with voices and expensive perfume. Men in tailored suits laughed like they owned the future. Women in silk dresses turned to assess new arrivals with practiced precision. Grace felt her eyes land on her, measuring, cataloging, judging. She lifted her chin and kept her expression calm, channeling every ounce of strength she needed to face down creditors and survive brutal winters. Eli leaned close as they walked. They see only the surface. You see the truth. Remember that. The reception was being held in the hotel's grand ballroom, a space that made Thornhill Manor's sitting rooms look modest by comparison. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings. Mirrors lined the walls, multiplying the crowd into an overwhelming sea of wealth and privilege. Music floated through the air from a string quartet, soft and elegant, providing background to conversations where fortunes were casually discussed. When they were announced, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Thornhill, heads turned like a wave rolling through water. Whispers followed immediately, spreading through the room like wildfire. Grace felt them like cold fingers down her spine. Eli moved through the crowd with calm authority, greeting men who looked powerful and pleased to see him. Grace realized then that Eli wasn't just wealthy. He was important in ways that made others listen, defer, calculate how to gain his favor. She was the wife of someone who mattered, which made her matter by extension, even if these people didn't want her to. Constance appeared almost immediately, dressed in deep burgundy silk, with jet beading that caught light like captured stars. She looked perfect, polished, dangerous. Beside her stood a man with silver hair and a hard smile, all practiced charm concealing calculation. "Caleb, darling," Constance said with false warmth. And Grace, "How lovely you look this evening." The pause before lovely was deliberate, just long enough to suggest the opposite. "This is Randolph Blackwell, Colorado Mountain Development Company. We've been discussing some exciting expansion opportunities." Blackwell offered a slight bow, his eyes skimming over Grace like she was furniture placed in the wrong room. "Mrs. Thornhill, surely someone with your unique background understands the value of development, prosperity, jobs, progress." Grace heard the trap immediately. He wanted her to agree like an obedient wife, then smile at her own simple thinking while he and Constance exchanged knowing glances about her inadequacy. The room was listening, waiting to see if the mountain girl would stumble. She didn't. "I understand prosperity, Mr. Blackwell," Grace said calmly. "My family lived without it for years. But I also understand mountains." She met his gaze directly. "Have you walked the high country after a clear cut? Have you seen what happens when spring runoff turns brown with erosion? Have you watched an avalanche take down a hillside because the trees that held the snow were removed for profit?" Blackwell's smile tightened. "Business plans are made with numbers, Mrs. Thornhill, not sentimental stories." "Then your numbers should include what the mountains will do when they're pushed too hard," Grace replied evenly. "The land always collects its debt, sometimes in lives." A murmur rippled to the nearby guests. Not laughter, but interest. These were business people who understood risk and consequence, even if they didn't always want to acknowledge it. Before Blackwell could respond, a warm voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Thornhill, I've been hoping to meet you." Governor Pierce approached with his characteristic directness, shaking Grace's hand like she mattered. "I've been telling several people here about your appointment to the Mountain Community Advisory Council. Your perspective on sustainable development is exactly what Colorado needs as we move toward statehood." Grace felt the shift immediately. Constance's expression froze. Blackwell reassessed with visible surprise. Around them, people leaned in with renewed interest. The governor's public endorsement changed everything. Grace wasn't just Eli's unsuitable wife anymore. She was an official appointee with recognized authority. "I'm honored to serve, Governor," Grace said, finding her footing. "There are too many families in the high country whose voices aren't heard when development decisions are made. Someone needs to represent their interests." "Indeed," Pierce agreed warmly, "which is why I'd like to introduce you to several council members here tonight. If you'll excuse us, Constance." It wasn't really a question. Pierce smoothly extracted Grace from Constance's orbit, guiding her toward a group of men and women who looked genuinely interested rather than dismissive. As they walked away, Grace caught Constance's expression, fury barely concealed behind a social mask. For the next hour, Grace navigated conversations with surprising success. She talked about timber management with a forestry commissioner. She discussed water rights with a territorial judge. She listened far more than she spoke, asking questions that revealed intelligence rather than ignorance, acknowledging what she didn't know while demonstrating what she did. Then Victoria Harrington arrived. Grace saw her first as a ripple of attention moving through the crowd. Men straightening slightly, women adjusting their postures in response to competition. Victoria was perhaps 26, blonde and beautiful in a pale blue gown that probably cost more than Grace's family had earned in a year. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to occupy any space she entered. Victoria walked directly toward Eli as if pulled by invisible thread, offering her gloved hand with practiced grace. "Eli, darling, Father has been hoping you'd reconsider our railroad contract proposal. The Harrington Steel expansion could benefit Thornhill Timber significantly." Then she turned to Grace with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "And you must be the little mountain flower everyone's been whispering about. How fascinating that Eli found you in such an unexpected place." The condescension was wrapped in politeness, but it landed like a slap. Grace felt heat rise in her chest, but refused to let it show. She'd learned long ago that anger poorly used was a gift to an enemy. "It's nice to meet you, Miss Harrington," Grace said evenly. "I've heard railroads can transform a region. The question is whether they transform it for people living there or only for the people collecting profits." Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting substance. Grace turned slightly toward Governor Pierce, who'd remained nearby. "Governor, earlier you mentioned watershed protection proposals. If those pass, they'll affect where rail lines can be built safely, won't they? I'd value your perspective on balancing development with environmental stability." In one smooth move, Grace had redirected the conversation from social gossip to policy discussion. The men nearby followed because power always follows what matters. Victoria was left holding her perfect smile with less air to breathe. But Grace saw something else in Victoria's eyes as they narrowed slightly. Recognition that the mountain girl wasn't going to be as easy to dismiss as expected. And behind Victoria, Constance watched an expression that promised this battle was far from over. The evening stretched on with Grace holding her ground, making no major mistakes, earning grudging respect from some quarters, while accumulating enemies in others. By the time they finally left, Grace's feet ached from unfamiliar shoes and her face hurt from maintaining composure. But she'd survived. In the carriage heading back to Thornhill Manor, Eli took her hand. "You were remarkable tonight." Grace leaned her head back against the seat, exhausted. "Constance looked ready to murder me." "Probably," Eli agreed, "but you made it much harder for her to dismiss you. You have allies now, real ones." Grace closed her eyes, feeling the weight of what she'd just accomplished and what still lay ahead. She'd entered Denver society and emerged standing. But Constance wouldn't accept defeat this easily. The real battle was still coming. The governor's winter reception came 3 weeks later, and Grace knew it would be Constance's final move. The intervening weeks had been spent in preparation, reading territorial law until her eyes burned, practicing social protocols with Mrs. Hartley's patient coaching, and attending 2 preliminary council meetings where she'd proven herself capable of asking intelligent questions and offering practical insights. But tonight was different. Tonight, the full weight of Denver society would be watching, and Constance had been unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. The Windsor Hotel's ballroom glittered with even more opulence than the Brown Palace. Chandeliers dripped crystal like frozen waterfalls. Women wore gowns that cost small fortunes, jewels that could feed families for years. Grace wore deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. Her copper hair swept into an elegant style, the pearls at her ears catching candlelight. She looked the part now, even if part of her still felt like an imposter. Victoria appeared early, circling like a predator who'd caught a scent. "Grace, darling, that's a lovely dress." Very appropriate for someone still learning the subtleties of evening fashion. The words were compliments wrapped around insults, delivered with a smile sharp as broken glass. Grace returned the smile with equal precision. "Thank you, Victoria. I find that focusing on substance over decoration serves better in the long term. Strong things last longer than delicate ones." Victoria's eyes flashed, but before she could respond, Constance materialized with Randolph Blackwell and several board members in tow. Grace recognized the formation immediately. This wasn't casual conversation. This was a coordinated assault. "Grace," Constance said with false warmth, "we've been having the most interesting discussion about the Thornhill Board's responsibilities regarding family reputation and business stability. Mr. Blackwell was just explaining how critical it is that company leadership demonstrates sound judgment in all areas, personal and professional." The trap was being set in real time. Grace felt Eli tense beside her, his hand finding hers briefly, a gesture of support and warning. Blackwell smiled with predatory politeness. "Indeed, in our world, Mrs. Thornhill, personal choices reflect on corporate credibility. Investors need confidence that leadership makes decisions based on strategic thinking rather than impulse." "Are you suggesting my marriage was impulsive, Mr. Blackwell?" Grace asked directly, refusing to pretend she didn't understand the implication. "I'm suggesting," Constance interjected smoothly, "that the board has certain concerns that need to be addressed for everyone's benefit, which is why I've asked Judge Morrison to join us this evening." A man stepped forward from the gathering crowd, older, distinguished, carrying a leather portfolio that immediately signaled legal authority. Judge Aldrich Morrison had a face like weathered granite and eyes that assessed everything with cool detachment. "Mr. Thornhill, Mrs. Thornhill," he said with formal courtesy that felt like ice. "I've been reviewing the Thornhill family trust documents at Mrs. Constance Thornhill's request. There are some provisions that require clarification." The ballroom had gone quiet around them. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Grace felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching, waiting to see the mountain girl finally brought down. Morrison opened his portfolio with deliberate slowness. "The trust established by your father, Mr. Thornhill, includes specific provisions regarding marriages that might affect the company's legal standing and reputation. According to Section 7, Clause 3, any marriage entered into by the primary heir must be reported to the board of trustees within 30 days for review and approval to ensure it doesn't compromise corporate interests." Grace's stomach went cold. Eli's face paled. "Your marriage," Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the silent room, "was conducted without prior notification to the board. Mrs. Constance Thornhill, as senior trustee, has brought a motion questioning the marriage's validity under corporate governance provisions. The board has voted that this union was formed irregularly and may be subject to dissolution on grounds that it potentially weakens the estate's stability through unsuitable connections." The words landed like hammer blows. This wasn't just social humiliation. This was a legal attack aimed at destroying Grace's marriage entirely. Around them, Denver society watched with barely concealed fascination. Victoria's smile was triumphant. Constance stood perfectly still, victory written in every line of her posture. Grace felt Eli move to speak, to defend, but she touched his arm gently, a signal to wait. She'd learned from Governor Pierce that the most powerful move was often the quietest one. "Judge Morrison," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "May I see the specific clause you're referencing?" Morrison looked surprised, but handed over the document. Grace read carefully, her eyes moving over the dense legal language with the same attention she'd given to mining claims and land deeds when her father couldn't read them. She'd learned that one misplaced word could ruin a family. She'd also learned how to find the weaknesses in seemingly ironclad documents. "This is interesting," Grace said quietly. The room leaned in. "Judge Morrison, this section does speak about board approval for marriages that might weaken the estate, but it also references contribution and standing as mitigating factors. Could you clarify what constitutes adequate standing under territorial law?" Morrison's confident expression flickered slightly. Standing typically refers to social position, family connections, financial contribution. "And official appointments?" Grace interrupted gently. "Public service roles that carry territorial authority?" The judge hesitated. Governor Pierce, who'd been standing nearby with carefully maintained neutrality, stepped forward with perfect timing. Under the Colorado Territorial Act of 1876, Pierce said clearly, his voice carrying authority that silenced any remaining whispers, "Official appointments to territorial advisory positions constitute recognized public standing. Such positions carry legal weight in matters of corporate governance, where contribution to community welfare is specified as a relevant factor." Grace turned back to Morrison. "Then I believe this matter is resolved, Judge. 3 weeks ago, I was appointed as Territorial Advisor for Mountain Community Development by Governor Pierce. The official documents were filed with the Territorial Secretary's office and carry the Governor's seal." She reached into her small evening bag, a calculated move she prepared with Pierce's help, and produced a folded document. "I have a certified copy here, if you'd like to verify." The judge took it with visible reluctance, his eyes scanning the official seal, the governor's signature, the formal language of appointment. His face drained of color. "This would indeed constitute recognized standing," Morrison admitted, his voice tight. "Under the circumstances, the trust provisions would be satisfied." Constance's face went from pale to flushed with barely controlled rage. "This is absurd. A hastily arranged appointment doesn't erase concerns about judgment and suitability." "Actually," Pierce interrupted, his tone pleasant but firm, "Mrs. Thornhill's appointment was based on merit, not timing. Her work on the council has already proven valuable. She provided critical insights on 3 development proposals, preventing what would have been costly environmental mistakes." He looked around the watching crowd. "I consider her one of our most promising advisors. Colorado is fortunate to have her voice in territorial governance." The endorsement from the governor, public, unambiguous, impossible to dismiss, changed everything. Grace watched realization ripple through the crowd. She wasn't a liability anymore. She was an asset. She wasn't unsuitable. She was officially recognized. Constance recovered quickly, her social mask sliding back into place, but Grace could see the fury burning beneath it. How convenient that this appointment materialized precisely when needed. How convenient that you tried to use corporate bylaws to destroy a legal marriage, Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "You cross a line tonight, Aunt Constance, in front of witnesses, in front of the governor and half of Denver's business community." He turned to Morrison. "The marriage stands. If the board has concerns about my judgment, they can raise them through proper channels. But my wife is not subject to your approval or disapproval. Is that clear?" Morrison nodded stiffly, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. He gathered his documents and retreated with the dignity of a man trying to salvage something from defeat. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming with renewed energy, now discussing the mountain girl who'd outmaneuvered Constance Thornhill rather than the scandal of an unsuitable marriage. Victoria stood frozen, her perfect smile finally cracking. Blackwell had already moved away, reassessing his alliances. Constance remained for one moment longer, her ice-gray eyes locked on Grace. "This isn't over," she said quietly, meant only for Grace's ears. "Yes, it is," Grace replied just as quietly. "You tried to use the rules to destroy me. I learned them better than you expected. And now everyone in this room knows that I belong here not because I married Eli, but because I earned my place." Constance turned and walked away, her entourage following, leaving Grace and Eli standing in the center of the ballroom as music resumed and the party continued around them. Eli pulled Grace close, his voice rough with emotion. "You planned that. The appointment, the timing, the certified copy. You planned all of it." "I prepared," Grace corrected. "The moment your aunt threatened our marriage, I knew we couldn't just hope she'd stop. We had to be stronger than her scheming." She looked up at him. "You wanted to know if I could love you without the money. I did. Now you know I can also fight for you with everything I have." Later, on the hotel balcony with Denver's lights flickering below like restless stars, Grace and Eli stood together in the cold night air. The battle was won, but Grace knew it had cost something. She'd become a player in games she'd never wanted to play, using strategies that felt foreign to her mountain-bred honesty. "Do you regret it?" Eli asked quietly. "Entering this world?" Grace considered. "I regret the deception that brought me here. But I don't regret fighting for what's mine, for what we're building together." She looked at the mountains rising in the distance, dark shapes against a darker sky. "Your aunt taught me something tonight. Power isn't just about money or connections. It's about knowing the rules well enough to make them work for you instead of against you." Eli wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "My mother would have liked you. She fought similar battles when she married my father. The Denver elite never fully accepted her either. But she won," Grace said. "She did, and so did you." They returned to Thornhill Manor as winter's first serious snow began to fall, transforming the valley into something pristine and unmarked. Grace stood on the veranda the next morning, watching sunrise paint the peaks gold and crimson, and felt something settle inside her, not peace exactly, but purpose. She'd survived. More than that, she'd claimed her place in a world designed to reject her. Constance's power had broken against Grace's determination like waves against stone. The mountain girl had become something more, and the story was far from over. The seasons turned, and with them, Thornhill Manor transformed from a place of secrets and power struggles into something Grace had never imagined when she'd accepted Eli's proposal on that desperate morning in Pine Ridge. A home that meant something beyond wealth. Constance left 2 weeks after reception. She departed without fanfare, her influence with the board shattered by her failed coup, her reputation damaged by the public spectacle of trying to invalidate a legal marriage. She took a position managing a smaller timber operation in California, as far from Colorado as pride would allow. Before she left, she stopped Grace in the hallway, her ice-gray eyes unreadable. "You won," Constance said simply. "I underestimated you. That was my mistake." "You saw me as a threat instead of a person," Grace replied. "That was your mistake." Constance almost smiled, a ghost of respect flickering across her face. "Perhaps, but you've learned to play the games now, Grace. Be careful they don't change you into something you don't recognize." The warning lingered after she left, a reminder that victory carried its own costs. Victoria Harrington married a railroad magnate 6 months later, a union that brought her exactly what she'd always wanted: status, wealth, and a husband who saw her as an asset rather than a partner. Grace saw her occasionally at territorial functions, and they maintained civil courtesy, though the warmth was performative on both sides. But these departures left space for something new to grow. Grace threw herself into her work with the Territorial Advisory Council, traveling into the high country to meet with families whose voices had never been heard in policy discussions. She documented their needs, their struggles with water rights and timber access, their concerns about development that destroyed livelihoods while enriching distant investors. Her reports became required reading for any business seeking territorial approval for mountain projects. Eli, freed from Constance's manipulations, restructured the Thornhill timber operations toward sustainable practices that balance profit with preservation. It cost them some contracts with companies like Blackwell's Consortium, but earned them something more valuable: respect from the communities that depended on the forest for survival. Together, they transformed Thornhill Manor itself. The East Wing became a school where mountain children could study during winter months when their own communities were snowed in. Grace hired teachers from Denver who understood that education meant more than social graces. It meant reading contracts so you couldn't be cheated, understanding mathematics so you could manage accounts, learning enough law to protect your rights. The outbuildings became housing for families displaced by mining accidents or failed claims, temporary shelter while they rebuilt their lives. Mrs. O'Brien's kitchen fed anyone who arrived hungry, no questions asked. The barn held medical supplies, and twice a month a doctor from Denver rode out to treat families who couldn't afford city physicians. It wasn't charity in the condescending sense Grace had witnessed in Denver society. It was community, built on the understanding that survival in the mountains meant supporting one another. Grace's father lived long enough to see what his daughter had become. He visited once, brought by Eli's carriage, and spent 3 days marveling at the mansion and gardens before pulling Grace aside with tears in his eyes. "I thought I was condemning you to hardship," Thomas Morrison said, his voice still rough with the illness that would take him before spring. "Instead, you found a way to turn survival into purpose. You taught me that," Grace replied, holding his weathered hands. "You taught me that dignity matters more than comfort, that doing right matters more than doing easy." He died peacefully in his own cabin 2 months later. With Sarah and Benjamin and Lucy around him, knowing his children were safe, and his eldest daughter had become someone who changed lives instead of merely surviving. "I forgive the man who was so lonely and afraid of being used that he hurt someone else to protect himself," Grace said carefully. "I don't forget it, though. And I won't let our children think that love built on tests is the same as love built on trust." Eli nodded, accepting the distinction. "You made me better than I was. Better than I probably deserved." "We made each other better," Grace corrected. "That's what partnership means." On Grace's 40th birthday, Governor Pierce, now Senator Pierce after Colorado achieved statehood, traveled to Thornhill Manor for a celebration that drew families from throughout the mountains. Workers and timber barons, homesteaders and politicians, all gathered in the valley that had once been a secret hidden from the world. Pierce pulled Grace aside during the festivities. "I've been authorized to offer you something. The new state legislature is creating a Department of Rural Development. They want you to head it." Grace looked at him with surprise. "That's a significant position." "You've earned it. 10 years of advocacy work, dozens of successful policy implementations, and the respect of communities across Colorado." Pierce smiled. "Also, frankly, you're one of the few people who can negotiate with both mining interests and homesteader coalitions without losing credibility with either side." Grace glanced across the meadow where Eli was teaching their son to split wood properly, where Elizabeth was organizing younger children into some elaborate game, where the twins chased each other through flowers that bloomed despite the altitude. She thought about her father's cabin, about the desperate girl who'd accepted a stranger's proposal, about the long path from powerlessness to purpose. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that I can still do the work from here, from the mountains. I won't become a Denver politician who forgets where she came from." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Pierce agreed. That night, as the last guest departed and stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Grace stood on a veranda where she'd first stood years ago, feeling trapped and alien. Now the valley spread before her not as a cage, but as a kingdom she claimed through intelligence and determination, and refusal to accept anyone else's definition of her worth. Eli joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "That I came here believing I was trading everything for survival," Grace said quietly. "And instead, I found a way to turn survival into transformation, not just for me, but for hundreds of families who needed someone to see them as human beings rather than resources to exploit." She leaned into his warmth, watching moonlight silver the stream that wound through the meadow. "Your aunt was right about one thing. The games changed me, but they didn't break me. They taught me that power matters less than how you use it. That privilege means nothing if you don't fight for people who have none. My father would have hated what you've done here," Eli said with a slight smile. "He built this empire by being ruthless. You're dismantling that legacy piece by piece, replacing it with something that actually helps people." "Good," Grace said firmly. "Empires built on exploitation deserve to be dismantled." The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, like the mountains themselves exhaling after holding secrets too long. Grace thought about the girl she'd been, desperate, trapped, believing her only value was in sacrifice. She thought about the woman she'd become, powerful not because of money or position, but because she'd learned that real strength came from refusing to let circumstances define limits. She'd married a poor mountain man who wasn't poor. She'd entered a mansion that felt like a cage. She'd faced down society and corporate power and family manipulation, and she'd won not by becoming like them, but by remaining stubbornly, defiantly herself. The mountains kept what they honored, and Grace Morrison Thornhill, mountain girl, territorial advisor, advocate, mother, partner, had earned her place among the peaks not through birth or marriage, but through the oldest currency the high country recognized. Survival transformed into service, hardship transformed into wisdom, powerlessness transformed into purpose. She'd come to these mountains to save her family. Instead, she'd learned to save herself. And in doing so, she'd built something that would outlast her, a legacy not a wealth, but a worth measured in lives changed and communities strengthened and children taught that power meant nothing unless you used it to make the world better than you found it. The stars wheeled overhead. The wind sang through the pines. And Grace stood in her kingdom, built not from timber and stone, but from every hard choice and small victory and moment of refusing to be less than she was. She thought he was poor. He'd been rich. But in the end, neither poverty nor wealth had mattered nearly as much as the question they both had to answer. Who would they choose to become when tested by a world that wanted them small? Grace had chosen to be immense, and the mountains, which recognized true strength when they saw it, had made space for her among their eternal peaks.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for joining Grace on this incredible journey. If her story of courage, transformation, and triumph moved you, please thumbs up like this video outbox tray, share it with someone who needs inspiration, bell subscribe to the Brian's Tales for more stories of resilience, romance, and characters who overcome impossible odds. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life.